Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be in the room physically with all of you tonight, and it's a pleasure to share the stage with my colleagues. You know, really tonight is about discussing the key developments of 2022 and what those events really tell us about human rights in 2023. So let me start with the story, I think, that has shocked the world and dominated the headlines in 2022. Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Now, you'll obviously hear more of that from my esteemed colleague, Tanya Lokshina, shortly, but there is so much to say about the human cost of this horrific war, and it is impossible to start reflecting on 2022 without talking about the unspeakable suffering of Putin's war. But it's not only the suffering. This war has also catalysed an unprecedented international response. The United Nations Human Rights Council created mechanisms for human rights scrutiny in both Ukraine and in Russia. And while the UN General Assembly repeatedly condemned both Russia's invasion and its human rights violation, it also suspended Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. The International Criminal Court has opened an investigation into Ukraine following a referral from an unprecedented number of the court's member countries. And governments, including the EU, the US, the UK and Canada, have mobilised to impose targeted sanctions to weaken Putin's global influence and military power. The world's response to Ukraine shows what is possible when governments come together to fight back against autocratic power grabs and widespread human rights violations. Now, the road ahead will be long for Ukraine. The ongoing attacks on civilians and the horrendous abuses should be a reminder to the international community that their stamina is critical to maintain consolidated support and pressure. 2022 should have been a moment, rather, of reflection for governments to really consider where we would be if the international community had made a concerted effort to hold Putin to account for the crimes that he'd earlier committed. You know, such as, what if there had been an intervention when Russia invaded eastern Ukraine and started the war in 2014? Or in 2015, following Russia's intervention to support Syrian forces under Bashar al-Assad? Or for the escalating crackdown within Russia over the last decade? Indeed, 2022 reminded us, yet again, that accountability for human rights violations is critical to protect human rights around the world. And accountability is key in Ethiopia, where 2 years of a brutal armed conflict between the government and Tigrayan forces ended with a fragile truce. But justice for atrocities committed during the war, which Human Rights Watch has found amounted to crimes against humanity, is critical to break the deadly cycle of violence and impunity. Because we know from decades of work that there is absolutely no chance for lasting peace without justice. And it's critical in Myanmar, where the murderous military junta, which actually moved from violently suppressing protests, has evolved their campaign into an all-out military assault on the people's resistance following the February 2021 coup. And the coup's architects are the same perpetrators that Human Rights Watch has determined to be perpetrators of crimes against humanity and genocidal acts against the Rohingya Muslim population. And it reminds us, you know, in real time, of the deadly cost of impunity. Accountability is also critical in Brazil, where after months of perpetuating the myth of stolen presidential elections, thousands of former President Jair Bolsonaro supporters stormed several of Brazil's democratic institutions in the past days. They did that to subvert the results of last year's presidential election. Now, those who incited the violence, orchestrated it, and financed it must be brought to justice, because accountability is ultimately the best antidote for autocracy. But 2022 has also shown us what's possible when countries big and small, come together and realise their human rights obligations. Even when traditional allies like the United States waffle on their human rights commitments in the name of political expediency, other countries can step into the breach. Whether it's South Africa, Namibia and Indonesia's work to pave the way to call out the Israeli government's crime of apartheid against Palestinians, or whether it's the Pacific Island governments who are demanding more ambitious emissions reductions, or it's the green wave of abortion rights expansion in Argentina, Colombia and Mexico, we are seeing human rights leadership in all corners of the globe, and we need to see more of this in 2023. But at the same time, we need to see that governments ensure that there is absolutely no daylight between their actions abroad and their actions at home. The UK government, since we're here, we'll spend a moment on them, has led or been part of the world's response to Ukraine, to Beijing's abuses in Xinjiang, or accountability in Myanmar. Yet, the proposed repeal of the Human Rights Act to laws that fundamentally erode the right to protest, to strike, to seek asylum, the British government has steamrolled through a raft of laws which makes the UK a less free and just society. So, in a time of closing civic space, 2022 has also reminded us of the importance of solidarity. Solidarity with the protesters in Iran, who risk their lives every day to demand an end to the government's repression and to fight for a more rights-respecting future. And you'll hear actually from my colleague Tara about what we can expect from the future of the protests as they continue. And we need to ensure that there is solidarity with more than the 1 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang province in China, whose ongoing detention and abuses by Beijing, which HRW has found amount to crimes against humanity, requires a robust and consolidated international response. And my colleague Yacho will speak to you about what's needed and what the recent protests mean in challenging President Xi Jinping's grip on the country. And solidarity with the women in Afghanistan, as the Taliban systematically strips them of their fundamental rights and essentially is trying to erase them from the visible social fabric of Afghan society. This is not just bad for Afghan women, this is bad for the entire country. And solidarity for those fighting for equality, dignity, and humanity in Sudan, in Myanmar, in Palestine, and in Sri Lanka. The list is long and the call to action is clear. 2022 showed us there is no sitting on the fence when it comes to protecting human rights. Ukraine is a reminder of the extraordinary potential of all governments when they recognise their human rights responsibilities on a global scale. And in 2023, governments should bring that same commitment to the multitude of human rights crises around the world, not just when it suits their interest. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tarana, for sharing with us those insights. And now we're going to hear from a number of our experts from Human Rights Watch, and particularly those experts who are working on some of the countries which are I think the most relevant in terms of human rights abuses that are happening at this very current moment. So the first person we'll hear from will be my colleague Tanya Lakshina, who'll be speaking about, who's our expert on Ukraine and Russia. We'll then hear from our expert on China, Yacho Wang, and then finally we'll be hearing from our Iran expert, Tara Seferini-Farr. So I will hand over first to Tanya.
Thank you, Yasmin. Look, I think it's very symbolic that we are holding this event here at the Frontline Club, the hub for journalists reporting on wars and crises. As Tirana said, 2022 was indeed the year of a major crisis, the year which brought a bloody and protracted war to Europe for the first time in decades. Russia has been fighting this war in Ukraine for 8 years, but the full-scale invasion happened in February 2022, and for 11 months now, Russia has been perpetrating horrific crimes in Ukraine. The litany of Russian war crimes is practically endless. And right now, as we are gathering here, right now as we speak, Russia continues bombing Ukrainian energy infrastructure, effectively terrorizing civilian population and leaving millions and millions of people without heat, without electricity, without water in winter time. I was in Ukraine last myself back in November and was already getting pretty cold. And I remember so vividly at night in the big cities, in Kiev, in Kharkiv, staring at the sky and seeing the stars and constellations looming so bright in this pitch darkness, as if I was camping out in a desert. It was frightening. It was very, very uncanny. Russia's crimes in Ukraine are shocking, but most unfortunately, they're not surprising. And I want to reiterate Tirana's point here. The war that we are seeing right now follows on years and years of next to absolute impunity for Russia's crimes in Chechnya, for Russia's crimes in Georgia, for Russia's crimes in Syria. So when the world was shaken by the revelations of Bucha this past spring, the extrajudicial killings, the forced disappearances, the despicable acts of torture, I was appalled, but I was not surprised, as I spent years and years in my professional capacity documenting similar crimes perpetrated by Russian forces in Chechnya. In fact, this is my second time speaking here at the Frontline Club, and the first time was 20 years ago, in 2003, when I delivered a talk on Chechnya, where Russian forces disappeared about up to 5,000 people during the Second War alone. No one was held to account. No one was punished. And therefore, what we see today in Ukraine is indeed not surprising. And when we think about Mariupol, which was practically leveled with ground, what immediately comes to mind are the horrific images of Grozny and the horrific images of Aleppo. It's not the first time we are seeing this. And unless there is accountability, those abuses will never end. Now, the kind of abuses Human Rights Watch is documenting in Ukraine, in Kiev region, in Chernihiv region, in Kharkiv region, across the country, are the same types of abuses that we were documenting in Chechnya, the same types of abuses that we documented in Syria. It's about indiscriminate bombing and shelling. It's about terrorizing civilian population. It's about sexual violence, torture, killings, and forced disappearances. And this has to end. Now, the war would not have been happening if not for the impunity for past abuses during the other armed conflict in which Russia was involved. But the war also would not have been happening if not for the horrendous human rights crackdown inside Russia itself. Russia is now as close to the USSR as it could possibly get. The crackdown has been ongoing for a decade now. But as of the 24th of February, as of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the level of repression became so staggering that we can indeed talk about a fully fledged war on critics, a fully fledged war on all forms of dissent. All the opposition politicians in Russia are now either behind bars or in exile. The government pushed through the parliament several pieces of legislation that make it a criminal offense to even call the war what it is, to call the so-called special military operation a war, an armed conflict. That's prosecutable offense. Criticizing Russia for abuses in Ukraine is also a prosecutable offense. And therefore, it's simply impossible for independent journalists to remain on the ground. And media outlets flood the country in whole teams. The government is also shutting down all the major human rights organizations in Russia. Memorial, the leading rights group in the country and one of the winners of last year's Nobel Prize for Peace, was closed down by the authorities. Right now, the government is seeking to close down the Moscow-Helsinki group, the eldest of human rights organizations in Russia, in solidarity with which Human Rights Watch was in fact created back in 1980s. Speaking of Human Rights Watch, we no longer exist in Russia. Our office operated in the country for over 30 years. Back in April, the government shut us down on par with 14 other international and foreign organizations, including Amnesty International, including all the German political foundations and other. The government makes it very clear they do not want to tolerate any critics, international or domestic. But nevertheless, there are still Russian activists, Russian human rights defenders, staying in the country, working in the country against all odds at great personal risk. Those are the people who helped forcibly transfer the Ukrainians to get themselves extricated from Russia. Those are the people who provide assistance to victims of human rights violations and who meticulously document governmental abuses. And these people find themselves in a position very similar to that of Soviet dissenters. And they need our solidarity just as much as Soviet dissenters years ago needed the solidarity of the international community. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tanya. I'm now going to pass to Yacho to speak about China.
Thank you so much for coming tonight and for having me in London, the second greatest city in the world. Sorry, I'm from New York. And I'm having some great non-British food here. 2022 was a traumatic and grim year for human rights in China, but it was also a very hopeful year. Traumatic was because for most of the year, people in China were being subjected to the draconian zero COVID measures. Many people were denied access to food, medicine, medical care, and or other life necessities because they were all locked down in their home. As Human Rights Watch has documented, some even died from that. And then the economy started to tank, and people went to the street to protest. So the government abruptly lifted all the restrictions without much preparation. Now there have been massive COVID infections across the country. China's COVID policy really shows that President Xi Jinping, who now in effect is president for life, is running the country on a whim. He does whatever he wants with no checks from his own people, with no accountability from anyone. And the world has to think about the implications of that. A dictator running the second largest economy in the world with unlimited and unaccountable power. And we all know China produced so much stuff we all use across the globe, including clean energy technologies that are accidental to the survival of this planet. Countries need to come together and strategize how to reduce the possibility of this one man in Beijing runs amok, like the man in Moscow has been doing since last year, and reduce the harms he can inflict on not just people in China, but people across the globe. 2022 was also a very inspiring year for me and many people across China. After suffering so much because of the unscientific and abusive COVID policy, people went to the street to protest across the country. They were not only demanding the end of the zero COVID policy, they were calling for democracy, for freedom, for human rights. Some even shouted that President Xi stepped down, the Chinese Communist Party stepped down. And some even showed solidarity with the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, against whom the Chinese government is committing crimes against humanity, as Human Rights Watch has documented. And it's not just, university students who are protesting. It's also factory workers, migrant workers, women's rights activists, LGBT groups. And it's not just people inside the country. It's also the Chinese communities across the globe. And I think this is transformative because in the past, protests in China were always about a specific issue, usually confined in one location, whether it's pollution, it's unpaid wages, it's illegal land appropriation. But this time, people are making political demands. Yes, the protest has died down, and many are suffering the grim consequences of daring to protest in China. Human Rights Watch is currently assessing the scale of arrests and disappearance of the participants. But I believe the sense of solidarity, the sense of community, the sense of empowerment people gained from protesting will be long-lasting. People feel, if I take a risk, if I stand up, things can change, that I am entitled to have a say in how I am governed. And that kind of empowerment will propel protests in the future. Lastly, I want to say that, when I'm interviewed by journalists, I usually end with a message. Thank you for covering human rights in China. Truly, human rights activists in China, they are fighting not because they are looking for immediate gains, not because, they believe, I'm going to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party or democracy is coming to China tomorrow. They are fighting because they believe in the simple message in the UN Declaration for Human Rights. All humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. And you journalists' coverage of their stories gives their sacrifices and their sufferings validation and acknowledgement. And that is very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yao Cho. Very, very much appreciated for your thoughts. Tara, I'm going to turn to you to talk about Iran, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us. And thank you to my colleagues for putting all the work behind the scene to bring us together after several years of COVID isolation policies. I'll be speaking mostly about the protest in Iran. Since September 16, following the death of Mahsa Jina Amini, the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman in the custody of Iran's abusive morality police, Iranians have started a protest movement that has captured the attention of the world, with iconic images of women burning their headscarf in streets of Tehran and school children leading their own protests. Some may have been surprised by the scale, durability, and the widespread nature of the protests following a single incident of unjust and brutal death. But for protesters who took to the street despite enormous risk, Mahsa's unjust death was not an isolated event. It was the latest example of systematic violence that Iran's police unleashes on women for their choice of dress code, and decades of ongoing impunity for abuses that are being committed by authorities. I think it's important to emphasize that in Iran, compulsory hijab laws are not just a choice of dress code that is being limited by authorities. Compulsory hijab laws impact every aspect of a woman's life. Access to education, access to employment, a mere existence in public space. These protests that are happening at the time that organized civil society, such as teachers movement, labor unionists, human rights defenders, have been under increased pressure, brings together decades and generations of demands, connecting women's struggle for autonomy over their own body to the broader demands for democratic rights and civil and political rights in Iran, with the leading slogan, "Woman, Life, Freedom." Regrettably, but not surprisingly, Iranian authorities have responded to these protests with brutal, lethal force. The lethal force we've documented is much more violent in minority areas, Kurdish majority cities, and in Zahedan, in Sistan and Baluchistan province, where the largest killing of protesters in a day happened following a Friday prayer protest. Authorities have also unleashed mass arrests of protesters, as well as arrests of hundreds of human rights defenders, lawyers, journalists, and peaceful dissidents in attempt to prevent a mobilization and solidarity with the protesters. The reports of torture, abuse, and systematic violations of due process rights are very disturbing. As we speak, at least 4 people have been executed in connection to the protest. Authorities have taken the use of charges that can carry the death penalty against protesters to a whole new level. Human Rights Watch opposes death penalty in all circumstances because it's inherently cruel and irreversible. But it's hard to overstate how unfair these trial processes have been, with authorities violating not only international standards, but also domestic safeguards to rush these people to the gallows. These people have been systematically deprived of access to the lawyer of their choice during trial, and reports of torture and coerced confessions have been ignored. Due to international and domestic pressure, people have been able to slow down the pace of these executions, with Supreme Court looking into overturning a few of them. But authorities, judicial and intelligence authorities, are so determined to carry out this execution that before the latest round that just happened last week, they arrested the 2 journalists who were reporting on the trial proceedings and speaking to families about the unfair nature of it just before carrying out these executions. And the abuses are ongoing. There are several other people at imminent risk of being executed. I know that most international eyes are on street protest as the most visible sign of people showing their demands. And they may have slowed down at the moment, mostly due to extreme repression that is happening. But every day, a wide range of people, from celebrities, athletes, actors, directors, to ordinary people, are putting on individual and collective acts of resistance. For instance, by refusing to abide by compulsory hijab laws, reminding Iranian authorities that from here, for them, there's no going back. So regardless of how severe the repression is going to become, and unfortunately we expect it to increase, I think the movement, this protest movement, has achieved something and has managed to create an alternative reality that very loudly echoes demands for fundamental change.